Hello everyone, this is Nyessa, and welcome to the second part of Let's Talk The Elder Scrolls Online Beta Reactions. In the last video, I discussed the character creation, the combat mechanics, and the crafting, and my general impressions of those aspects of the game from the perspective of a longtime Elder Scrolls fan who primarily plays single-player games and who has not played any multiplayer games in over a decade. In this video, I'd like to go a different direction and discuss with you my impressions of the world, the story, and the quests, or at least what I've seen so far of those things. And as I promised in the previous video, I am going to give my answer to the question that a lot of people have been asking, which is, can we really consider The Elder Scrolls Online to be a true Elder Scrolls game? Now, before we talk about anything else, I would like to speak briefly about the setting of the game, specifically its setting in time. I think that the developers made a very smart decision when they chose to place this game in Tamriel's past, and to separate it from the timeline of the main series of single-player games. And the interregnum, in particular, may have been the best possible choice for when to set this game. Partly that's because this was a period of time in Tamriel's history when there wasn't a lot recorded about specific events. We do know a few things about what happened during this time period, and we know how it ended with Tiber Septim beginning his dynasty and his empire. But we don't know a lot of the details of the many things that occurred during these hundreds of years. However, the game is anchored to one of the events that we do know about, which is the Akaviri invasion of Morrowind, which happened something like 10 years before The Elder Scrolls Online actually begins. I think that too was a smart choice, because for those of us who are invested in the lore of this world, and to know the significance of these things, it gives it a little bit more of a sense of time, a sense of continuity with the rest of Tamriel's history. But the most important thing that I think this decision does to help The Elder Scrolls Online is that it helps to clarify that this is not intended to be a Skyrim sequel, as I've heard some people speak of it. It's not going to replace the single-player games, and it's not going to be the next chapter of the Elder Scrolls story. This is very clearly something separate from the single-player storyline, the ongoing story that we see from Arena through Skyrim and beyond to whatever games will follow. With that in mind, from here I'd like to go in roughly chronological order and give my impressions of the story, the quests, and the world from when I started the game to where I was by the time the beta ended. I warn you that there will be spoilers ahead for the opening area that everyone sees and for the starter areas of the Ebonheart Pact. So if you don't want to hear any of the details of what happens in those areas before you get a chance to play for yourself, please feel free to skip ahead, and I will put in an annotation that will skip you ahead automatically to the place where the spoilers end. So please skip ahead now if you don't want to hear spoilers, and the spoilers will begin in 3, 2, 1, now. So everyone begins the game after having been sacrificed to the Daedric Prince Molag Bal by the necromancer Mannimarco, who's rather a famous figure in Tamrielic history. And we begin in the realm of Oblivion known as Cold Harbor. And as any good Elder Scrolls game should begin, we are prisoners in this realm, and we need to make our escape. So this is our first introduction to the single-player storyline, which has to do with, among other things, getting back our soul, which has been taken from us. And this area does do its job of teaching us the basic gameplay mechanics, the basic combat mechanics in particular, but I found that it didn't do a lot to invest me in the storyline that it started, and this is a problem. In spite of the fact that we were in a situation that should have been pretty darn tense, I didn't feel a whole lot of tension here, and I didn't feel like I had a chance to really get to care about any of the characters that we met, especially the character of Lyris Titanborn. So when she makes her sacrifice at the end of this area to free the prophet, taking his place in the prison, it was clearly intended to be a dramatic moment, but I have to admit that I didn't feel much of anything. And that is clearly a weakness in the way this beginning is set up. And it's a weakness that continues into the next starting area, which was the starting area for the Ebonheart Pact, the island of Bleak Rock. Now, I understand that the developers have responded to the many complaints that have come up about these starting areas. The starting areas will no longer be required. Instead, you'll be set down in your faction's main city, and you'll have the option to go and do the starting areas after you've already begun. But for the beta, these changes had not been implemented, so I went through the starting areas, and this pretty much took up all of the time that I had available to play the beta this weekend, which meant that I never had a chance to get out beyond this very linear line of quests and explore what else there was to be seen in the Ebonheart Pact area, or for that matter, to go out and check out the PvP areas in Cyrodiil. Now, Bleak Rock Isle had the same sort of problem for me that Cold Harbor did, in that it didn't get me invested right away into the storyline and the quest that I was immediately set upon. And it didn't help that I was immediately started in an area that is a part of Skyrim, so it's more of the same snow and Nords and Nord ruins that we've seen a lot of in Skyrim. And, okay, I am not tired of the game Skyrim. I love this game. I wouldn't be doing a Let's Play of it if I didn't still enjoy playing, but I will say that the game of Skyrim has the least interesting setting of the Elder Scrolls games that I've played so far. And the setting is one of the big things that drew me to the Elder Scrolls games in the first place. It was the utter strangeness of the landscape and the creatures in Morrowind that made me fall in love with the Elder Scrolls. And I was really looking forward to jumping into that same sort of strangeness right away, but instead I got the same thing that I've been playing for the last 2 years. And while I understand that for some players who are coming from Skyrim and jumping into the Elder Scrolls Online, this setting and the familiarity of the setting may help ease them into the game. But for me, it just felt really frustrating, because one of the big appeals of the Elder Scrolls Online is that we get a chance to move out of the same setting that we've been in and out into the larger world and to explore all these different and strange places that made me fall in love with the Elder Scrolls in the first place. And aside from that issue, like Cold Harbor, I found that I didn't really care about the characters that I was supposed to be helping. It wasn't until the very end of this initial Ebonheart Pact starting area that I started to feel invested in what I was doing. So while I was being told that I had to go out and bring back these villagers who had wandered off and needed to come back in time for an evacuation or for a possible evacuation, there really wasn't any sense of urgency in the initial quests. I didn't feel like I actually had to hurry that much, and in fact I didn't. even when I got to the point where I said, yes, we have to start the evacuation now, I still had an opportunity to send back one more villager who I had missed the first time around. It wasn't until Daggerfall Covenant soldiers actually started to attack the island that I felt like anything I was doing mattered in the game. Yet I was still being forced to go through a very linear progression in order to get off this island and into the next starting area. But this just led into another starting area that I had to go through before I could get out into the world. Now, fortunately, the second starting area of Balfourian was much more engaging than the first area had been. Part of this was the setting, because now we were actually in Morrowind, which is a very, very different place than Skyrim. It has a very different feel to it. And we were also in a place that had a large Argonian population, so I got to see some of my own kind, who I had not seen very much of in the initial Bleak Rock area. It also just felt more open to me, even though I was still going through a fairly linear series of quests in order to get out of this area. At this point, I was also more invested in what was happening to the people who were giving me the quests, so it wasn't as frustrating for me to go through them. At the end of this progression, I was faced with a fairly classic sadistic choice, in which I had to choose which group of fighters I would support in a battle. And it was very clear that my choice would determine which group survived and which group didn't. However, because at this point I still didn't really care that much about the characters as individuals, it was a very easy choice to make. I chose to defend the civilian refugees and let the professional soldiers fend for themselves. I felt a bit of a pang when I made my choice, but honestly it didn't have that much of an emotional impact on me, and I think if I had been offered the choice to go through this quest line instead of being forced into it, maybe I would have had a bit more of an emotional investment in the outcome. So, to sum things up, especially for those who skipped ahead to avoid spoilers, I feel like the opening quests didn't do much to get me involved in the story or to make me care about the characters. And again, I do realize that the initial faction starting areas are something that will no longer be required at release. It'll be optional, so you can go back and do those later if you want to, but you won't be forced to go through them. And I think that is a very good thing. I expect that the experience of starting the game after release will be much better than it was for this beta. But I would still like to see the initial starting area that everyone goes through be a little bit more involved and maybe a little bit longer to help set up the story and make the player feel more invested in what happens. Now, once I got out into the world and off of those initial rails, I felt like the questing I encountered was a lot more comfortable, a lot more interesting, and a lot closer to what I would expect from an Elder Scrolls game. I picked up a lot of quests actually right away. As soon as I started looking around, there were plenty of things to do, and not nearly enough time to do it because I didn't have a whole lot of time between then and the end of the beta. But I'm really looking forward to getting the chance to do those quests once the game is released, and especially now that I know that I no longer will be forced to go through those initial starting islands all over again. So now we come to the all-important question, which is, do I consider the Elder Scrolls Online to be a true Elder Scrolls game? And my answer may surprise a few people, but I say, yes, it is. So while the game is not nearly as immersive as, say, Skyrim, in fact, I'd say it's more similar in feel to Oblivion, where immersion is concerned. And the game doesn't really do a good job, at least at the point that I've gotten to, of getting you into the single-player storyline. I do feel like this game is true to the world of the Elder Scrolls. And in fact, in some ways, it feels more like an Elder Scrolls game than Skyrim does. This is not to say anything bad about Skyrim, but the Elder Scrolls Online has that feeling of strangeness and otherworldliness, that feeling that I'm in a truly different place, that Skyrim never quite accomplished for me, just because the setting was already so familiar to my own cultural background, I guess. I was especially glad to see the Argonians getting to share the stage more than they have in previous games. I feel like, as an Argonian fan, the Argonians tend to get short shrift in the Elder Scrolls games. In Morrowind, they were mostly slaves. In Oblivion, they were around more, and they did have a more equal place in the society of Cyrodiil, but they still didn't have a whole lot of significance in the game. And in Skyrim, they were again relegated to second-class citizens. You only found them in a few places, and they weren't exactly in good circumstances. But even in the limited time that I had to play the Elder Scrolls beta this weekend, I've already seen more development of Argonian culture than I've seen in really any of the last 3 Elder Scrolls games. And that is something that I wasn't expecting. I had kind of low hopes and low expectations for the amount of attention, I guess, that Argonians would get in the Elder Scrolls Online, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that they are an equal part of the Ebonheart Pact alongside the Dunmer and the Nords. And I'm hoping that that will be true of all of the other races in the other pacts as well. I'm hoping that I will see fewer stereotypes and more interesting roles for characters of races that have not gotten as much attention in the Elder Scrolls games as, say, the Nords or the Imperials or the Altmer, who seem to be the ones that tend to get the most attention in terms of story and character development within the games, especially since Morrowind. So that's one of the things that I really like about this game so far, that it opens up the world more, that it broadens the world, both in terms of the settings and the races and the characters in general, and it still has that feel of being part of the Elder Scrolls universe, even if it doesn't have the same sort of immersion that Skyrim does. And I can even pinpoint for you exactly when I felt, yes, this is an Elder Scrolls game. And that was when I was wandering around Balfourian. I was in the Argonian village there, when I met 2 very interesting characters. Now, neither of these characters had any quest for me to complete, but I did talk to them both. And one of them was a Dunmer priestess of the Tribunal Temple. The other one was a traditional Argonian shaman and a follower of the Hist. What I liked about these 2 characters was that they didn't have anything for me to do for them, but they just wanted to complain about each other. And that felt really, really true to the world of the Elder Scrolls. We have this conflict coming out of the world building. That is what the Elder Scrolls is all about. The world is what creates the story in these games. And I think the Elder Scrolls Online seems to be accomplishing that, at least from what I've seen so far. So, overall, the Elder Scrolls Online may not be a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but I did enjoy playing it, and I did feel like I was in the world of the Elder Scrolls, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing it once it releases. With that said, I'd love to hear from you and see what you think of the story so far. If you were especially in one of the other starting factions, I would love to hear what you thought of those starting areas. And let me know if you are planning to play the game when it releases. I definitely am. And I'm going to leave you with a little bit of footage that I took at the very end of the beta, when the countdown started for the last few minutes of the beta. Everybody gathered in the center of the market in Davin's Watch, which is where I was at the time, and we all had a little dance party. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope that I'll be seeing you in the game.